for gay men in particular to find peace, to find tranquility, to find a place in which true healthiness actually occurs.
Yeah.
When I started my journey in coming out and leaving a crazy cult organization, I left one very close-knit community into another community that also seemed or felt close-knit. But it was actually, and I believe that this is everywhere, but particularly in Pittsburgh, gay culture is definitely centered around the bars. And there's no great third spaces for people to go and experience community without drinking, or even just the attitude or atmosphere that we find in a bar. And it took me stepping out of that scene and getting sober to find a space to be able to heal, to find a space where I feel complete and a whole person without needing to get that from another person or feeling like it's dependent on my career or how much money I have or all of those external things that people look to for happiness.
Yeah.
And it's been a journey, and it's been many years in the making. And I still feel that there's a void here in Pittsburgh for people to find that. And particularly men.
Sure.
So, I'm curious. You are originally from here, and then you moved to California, and you've been around the country.
I have.
What's your experience with transitioning through those cultures, finding community, and being in a place of healing?
I also grew up in evangelical Christianity, which again is also very much paralleling that you could have a really close-knit community, or you could feel really isolated and have to keep our identity and who we are and parts of ourselves really hidden, really under wraps, and that pressure and that stress ends up creating these mutations and distortions that often are kind of undealt with when we emerge and come out. And so that process for me, again, in my 20s was just like wanting to feel free, wanting to connect physically, emotionally, and the bars were there, and sometimes the performing arts, fortunately in Pittsburgh, was there. But when I moved to Los Angeles for grad school in 2006, you got to see again what a lot of people with such a vast spectrum of experience, especially queer experiences, could achieve, especially I'd say in the past 10 years. We do see more queer yoga teachers. We see the building of this healing, healer and wellness influencer culture in the past 10 years. But before the past 10 years, a lot of our socializing and connecting is either being done in bars, increasingly at music festivals, and also occasionally you find a community like I did with the Radical Fairies, where they are like pagan, eco-conscious, very into healing, very into counterculture. And we're lucky enough to find those cultures and to find a balanced, healthy space. So having come back, I definitely am passionate about welcoming our community in, because I call it the pancake stack of of pressures. Historically, there's a lot of kind of dogmatic Christianity that has to be worked through, processed. There's feeling kind of isolated within the very cosmopolitan coastal cultures in which we may try to emulate them or not, which is fine. But how are we finding our own identity here in Pittsburgh, right? And lastly, I would say that because so much of the culture, like you say, is focused on spaces where we're like drinking and otherwise in order to take away our inhibitions, in order to feel like it's easier to communicate and connect, especially with technology, and then the rampant isolationist culture that comes from remote work and still healing from the past 6 years. It is really important that we know how to socialize in person and have frameworks such as a healing and wellness community that will give us a space where we can be vulnerable and we can set up a trusting and caring and compassionate agreements to evolve ourselves. The last thing I think I'll say is I think the Creator made us queer for a reason. We are very magical people. We have unique perspectives, and anyone who feels this way in any way through their experience, we often get these unique challenges to have unique gifts to provide one another and to support one another with.
Through my journeys, one of the things that I found was spiritual retreat centers. You know, it's funny because sometimes we have to give up the spirits for the spiritual. And I'm not even talking about sobriety, right?
Yeah.
I'm just talking about finding balance in life.
Yeah.
And it's so easy for us in this culture to, that social lubrication, to have that drink, to head into a space in which we think it's going to be easier to meet people because we're really just looking for connection.
Yeah.
And in my opinion, that's what spirituality actually is connection. Connecting to, the people around us, connecting to source, connecting to the planet. All of those things are really, what makes connection important and really gives us that spiritual. I think of spirituality like Wi-Fi. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
It's we have our source. We need to connect to it, and if we're not connected, then we're not connected.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that's very much the way that I look at it. And we can choose what Wi-Fi network we're connecting to.
Yeah. We
can choose how we're connecting, what that source might look like. So one of the things that helped me was finding, for me, initially it was Easton Mountain, is a spiritual retreat center and campground up in upstate New York. And I started there in the recovery retreats, which I found that I really enjoyed. I stopped drinking and joined the world of sobriety and recovery about a little over 11 years ago now. And the recovery community in Pittsburgh for the queer community or gay community is fairly small. It is I'm seeing some expansion happening at the moment,
Yeah.
but traditionally, and especially during COVID, it was almost non-existent. So it's been important. There was a moment, I would say it was probably 2023, where I was telling people that I felt like I was on an island, that there just were not people in order for me to connect to in the way that I wanted to connect. I don't go to bars, but I do on a very rare occasion, just because it's not a great place for me. I find it's not a great place to be interacting with people, because the people that I do end up interacting with are, a little tipsy or inebriated, and then, their authentic self isn't showing up. Or we're, using the apps and meeting people there, and that's a whole nother kind of lens to connection that lacks authenticity.
Yeah.
So I started at these recovery retreats, and the community there was pretty amazing. I went to the first one just as a retreatant, and they really were looking at the whole person as far as gay culture. It wasn't sometimes at an AA meeting or an NA meeting, there, you go and it's very like, steps, sponsor, meetings, and it can be fairly rigid, which I think is important and
for
needed
boundaries, for having safe space,
Right. But being at Easton that week, that first week that I went, was really liberating. They had space in order for physical connection to happen, if it was going to happen.
Yeah.
They had a lot of workshops that were informative. They had information. There was fun things to do. They had great food. It really allowed me to sink into a place and experience what it is to be a gay male in its entirety. And it was funny because a lot of the things, I remember watching some of those old gay movies or old gay series, and you'd have the queens at the bar and singing and kind of, where the drag queen community came from.
Yeah.
And being there, and they had a cabaret, and watching that in a space where there was no alcohol and there was just people being silly and having fun. It was really brought me back into what it was like when I was coming out, when I was just finding out what this community was like. So, unfortunately, that's in New York. There's only a couple spiritual retreat centers that are geared towards the gay community, especially gay men, in the country. So, how do we bring that sense of community? How do we bring those priorities and those principles into more of a microcosm? Like, how do we bring that to Pittsburgh?
Well, certainly, I think, even as an educator, one of the axioms is meeting people where they are. And I think here in the Pittsburgh region, we are a courageous people. We are of rivers and mountains and tough terrain and sometimes vicious winters. So we have a kind of resilience. It's just, how are we directing that resilience, or how are we expressing both that toughness and having spaces to not have to be tough and to be vulnerable. I mean, there's a lot of layers, but when I think of specifically queer folks, especially male identifying queer folks, coming into the space, there's a level of recognizing and having an understanding that there are other spaces. We're starting to see social spaces. I'm starting to follow local Instagram profiles of, like, there's the soft spot in Garfield. There's another spot in Dormont. But I think there is a puzzle for especially the male identifying folks, because wherever we still have, whether you want to call it working class or Appalachian or all these kind of struggles and challenges between the generations too, because working class people have a really strong tavern culture, and then if you're working class and queer tavern culture, right? But we're also, we've been stereotyped as the creative people, the designers, and the fashion people, and that creativity can be focused and brought to a space where we can create. Like, come on in for a sound bath, learn how to play a bowl, learn how to do these things that, queer or not, are mediators of social connection, right? Especially now that we talk about neurodivergence as well. Queer, neurodivergent, having had a lot of processes to come through and still come through. I believe that we here at Rooted in Sound can provide the studio space in order for folks to come together and receive a sound bath, or learn how to just do some intentional sound work with a bowl, with a gong. The ways that maybe our trans and femme identified folks are having a lot more arts and crafts space. These are niche things, and it's okay to have your niche. But so in Pittsburgh, since I've moved back, it's been really great to see some of the trans and femme-centered spaces, like the soft spot in Garfield, and I know there's spots in Dormont that are offering safe space, and there's crafts, and there's coffee, and there's things like that. So those folks seem to be making some strides in how to connect, because they really prioritize that. I think we've got both the research in psychology and other fields and the lived experience of that, like, male identifying and male bodied folks are often feeling frustrated, perhaps some shame, or some guilt, or some really working through how some of our very specific fantasies of what an amazing queer male-bodied experience is, and having to adjust them, having to adjust out of the bar scene, having to adjust out of a kind of transactionalism that again, you don't have to go into a patriarchal rant about how male-bodied people and male-identifying people, it can be a real struggle for vulnerability. So a place like Rooted in Sound can provide a creative social engagement. Learn how to play a gong or a bowl or jam with your string instruments. And these are ways to both bring out the creative part of which queerness is so splendidly known. We are amazing creators. And also to provide that intermediary for social engagement and to build our community.
One of the things that I did was, after I went to school for coaching, I connected with the Gay Coaching Alliance. And the resources in which they had really made me want to bring some of those resources to Pittsburgh. as well as some other organizations like the Body Electric, School, and organizations like that, and connecting to them and doing some training there. I decided to bring the LGBTQ life coaching to Pittsburgh and start to do that work, as well as the intimacy coaching. Because you were talking about that connection, that physical connection, and not being so transactional. And what does that look like when everything that we do is a transaction? So as not just gay men, but men. And then sex really becomes transactional because there's, I think primarily, we didn't have the role models to see what healthy relationships could look like. And frankly, even a lot of our parents in straight relationships didn't necessarily have great relationships. So how do we sink into that space of intimacy, into me you see, that is not egocentric, that is not focused on a result, but really focused on just being together, just purely for enjoyment. So there's bringing that here, and I think as rooted in sound, bringing the embodiedness of sound, as well as then with coaching, bringing the embodiedness or the somatic experience of intimacy coaching, and marrying those things together, especially within maybe some gay workshops, or maybe some circles.
Where that's exactly one that I was thinking of. Because we are a sound spa here, and in the radical fairy tradition, we have heart circles, and so much of what you're speaking about is, again, a lot of our training as sound therapists is that there's just a fact that the mind can be dualistic. So we have objective and subjective. We either have being like a heroic or a warrior thing, then the opposite, or of that, and that is a lot of the challenge, and it is kind of gendered male, that the male is a brilliant mind, and then of course, like in traditional like cis heterosexual relationships, the mother's supposed to be nurturing. Those are constructs, and we have both of those things, and we're learning to balance those things. So these practices are a matter of, again, getting out of our heads. Tech folks, brilliant tech folks, yes, give your brain a break. And we are in the interest, the sincere, compassionate interest of letting our hearts start doing the leading. And creative work gets our hearts and our flow engaged. And putting the "it's been a long time since I've been intimate with someone" button on pause and say, what's it like to just have queer neighbors and friends? That's all right. For me, I believe that like you can be intimate and it can be playful and it might not happen again, but you don't know unless you kind of, we gotta know how to read one another's energy. Like the kids say, you gotta know what kind of vibes are up. And so if we don't know how to do that, and we have such a goal, an objective that person is being profiled as sexy and that person is not, and that person is someone who we need to get to know professionally, we're starting to be exhausted by that. Time to unplug this person is for that. That's transactionality. And say, these are my neighbors, these are my queer siblings, these roles can shift and change, but we have to practice knowing how to engage each other at the proper level so that we are going to be closer for whatever lies ahead.
I was in Nepal a couple of times in the last couple of years. And it's interesting because when we talk about intimacy, we don't necessarily talk about sex, right? There's a lot of ways of connecting, even physically, that's not necessarily sexual.
Yeah.
You know, there's all these in Nepal. Everybody's walking. All the guys are walking with their arms around each other. It's just part of the culture, and I think that we lose that.
Accessibility is connected to transactionality.
Right.
If I become very desirable, then that accessibility is something that is very real, but we don't often name it, especially in the male identifying queer, like this cis gay male culture, which again we're speaking about because we're finding that these stressors and the isolation and the putting on of all these personas that's not necessarily us, and the fear that the us is not enough, that's false. It's false spiritually and it's false socially.
I also find that if we can put down that what defines attractiveness, or what defines what we are attracted to, we also start to love ourselves more. There's there's interconnection where accepting self along with accepting others builds on each other.
Yeah.
So that we can start to connect in ways that are much more pure.
Yeah.
They're, again, being introduced to these larger groups of men that are all different sizes, all different shapes, even trans men coming into the groups, and being able to find ways of connecting with all of them in a way which maybe I wouldn't have connected before. There's techniques in which we learn in order to hold and cherish that we just don't experience without it becoming transactional. And I think that it's important to start to bring that to people's awareness and to start teaching it.
And I know that along the West Coast and the coastal cities, a lot of these coaches and retreat experiences are bubbling up. They're rising up. We are talking now specifically about Pittsburgh and the readiness and the willingness and the openness of our community. Because, for me, this is an invitation, like in a very Pittsburgh way. Come on down and start experimenting. We're recording this during the week of the Honcho Camp. So I'm just being very real that folks are coming from all across the country and all across the world sometimes through these very specific music festival, partying in the woods, gonna take some consciousness expanding things, and there's drag. There may even be people doing sound baths there. But for folks who are finding that their pathway is taking them out of that, namely wanting a sober space, whether they have a sober space or not, being able to continue to have spaces that are not depending on those things, like we've said before. Something I would love, Rooted in Sound, to start offering to our community. And for my part, to be a point person that will take ideas in and make it accessible. And, I'll brew the kava tea and I'll bring instruments and and provide a lot of joy and warmth and experience. But folks have to be vulnerable enough and willing to take that risk that it's a social event, and it's also within a wellness community event. You don't have to be, this is not Puritan Christian culture like we're talking about. This is come as you are, come as your best self, and be curious and be willing to have conversations with people you wouldn't necessarily, because we are trying to open and get rid of these limiting thoughts and feelings that seem to be, a broken record of why we feel isolated, emotionally untended to or cared for, and depressed and anxious. And you come back to wellness and you come back to sound therapy, and it's really helped me for sure.
If you are interested in finding ways in order to connect to yourself, to others, to source, whatever that may be, we have some avenues to do so here at Rooted in Sound. One is, we have a predominantly queer staff. So this is a safe space for anybody to come to. Travis is our massage therapist. So if you're looking to become more embodied and need a therapeutic touch, massage is extremely powerful. And that coupled with the sound therapy of the vibroacoustic tables while he's doing the massage, it's like being blanketed in vibration and love. So it's a beautiful experience. We have our sound baths, which are open to the public on Thursdays and Saturdays, Thursday evenings and Saturday mornings, where it's a great place to find the embodied feeling of these sounds in the room, the gongs, the drums, the hand pans, the flutes, while you're on that sound cloud, so that it starts becoming a little bit more embodied again. There's the private sessions as well, coming in and working one-on-one with a sound therapist, whether it's a sound massage or a specialized sound session where you may be integrating biofield tuning and toning in your voice and a few different things in order to take the person where they may need to go. But or just sound Reiki, that being in that space. And then also into the coaching realms where, you can come in and work with a coach to start to accomplish the goals in which you want to accomplish. And that's pretty powerful. Often when we think about coaching, we think about maybe career coaching or executive coaching, which we know can really help us level up our career. Well, how about just our life? Mm-hmm. Do we really want to level up and look at all the aspects of our life, not just our career, not just our physical attributes, but really all of those aspects of our life? Sure, we can go to the gym and work out until we have this perfect physique, but have a heart attack or a stroke at 40 because we also were drinking too much or using substances or not eating properly. There's it's all of those aspects, and just the amount of sadness that we have within our community. People that are, everybody's lonely. Even those in relationship tell me that they're lonely. So, how do we start to address some of those issues of feeling lonely or bored.
You know, one of the bedrock actions of mammals is snuggling up to each other. The lions, the elephants, the primates, the cats and dogs. We see this, and for us to not have this, especially, you know, the gay or queer male community, we're seeing the struggles and the pain and the suffering involved in not allowing ourselves to be more sociable, and learning how to do that, finding what the healthy ways to do that are with each other, communicating that and gathering and letting ourselves be our best selves. So I'm very excited to be back in my hometown and to be a resource and a friend and a support, so that it's not just going to the coast or going out in the woods all the time, but having local things, having local community in order for us to be the community that we kind of hoped and desired ever since all of us are little young queer folk looking for friends and community and chosen family.
You know, I would say look for more things to come. We're going to be introducing a few different new events and circles and groups, so stay tuned, and we have more content yet
Indeed.
to come.
Thank
Thank you for joining us.